Welcome back. So before we continue, we have to look at this very beautiful drawing that I just made. What I want to show you here is kind of how we will communicate in the application between the layers. And that's a very important thing to know before we start adding references inside the Visual Studio application. So if we're looking here, you have the UI layer, you have the business logic layer, you have the data access layer, and you have the entity layer, which is what we call cross-cutting. So it's actually used in between all the layers. Now you cannot do this. You cannot say, I want this guy to know about this guy and I want this guy to know about this guy. You cannot go both ways, because that would make what we call a reference, a circular reference, meaning that they would just keep talking and go into never-ending loops, and nobody likes never-ending loops. So what we're going to do is actually the normal way of doing it is saying that the UI goes to the business logic layer, so we'll have an arrow down here. The business logic layer knows about the data access layer, and the data access layer is the guy who knows about the database, which is outside of the project, but still I just wanted to add that line as well. And then all of them knows about the data entities. So all of these guys will know about, or let's call them business entities here, so they all know about that package, okay? And this guy is not allowed to know about any of these guys. Hope that makes sense. Now, I will not talk about it now, but we might turn this line around at some point, but let's just keep it so that the business logic layer knows about the data access layer for now. Let's go and do this inside Visual Studio, and let's start out by making a reference from the UI layer right here down to the business logic layer. So I'm going in to my code, and here we have the UI. I know it's not placed the same way as I would like on my drawing. Notice the UI is in the bottom, where it's actually in the top here, but you'll just have to either rename them, put in some better names, or just accept this is the way it looks. I'll accept it. We have something here called dependencies right below, and what you can do is actually you can right click this guy and say I want to add a reference. Now a reference is kind of what I try to show right here with the line inside the UI. I want this guy to know about this guy. I don't want this guy to know about this guy. So I only want the line to go down, right? So going back, it means that I want the customer app UI that I'm looking at right now to know about the customer BLL layer, right? I also wanted to know about the entity layer. So going back to my drawing, I also want this guy to know about the entity layer. Okay, so now I've kind of made that setup. I'll just say save here, okay. Let me just zoom out again so you guys can see this. If I expand the dependencies now, I'll see that under projects I actually have 2 access points right now, meaning I have the 2 lines I just showed you. Okay, so now the UI is set up. It has the right reference right here. The business logic layer also needs a reference to the data access layer and an access to the entity layer. So going back here, opening the business logic layer, right-clicking the dependencies, saying add reference, saying I want access to the data access layer and the entities, but I do not want access to the UI. That's very important. Saying okay to that, now it has the dependencies I require there. Good. Going back to the drawing, the last one is I want the data access layer to know about the database. That's nothing to do with layering, so let's just not do anything about that, but it also needs to know about the entities. So let's do that. We need the data access layer to know about the entities. Right-clicking dependencies, add reference, and go and say I want that to be known right here. Say okay, and there we go. Now we have the dependencies set up. Entity knows about nobody. The other ones know about the different layers depending on the different arrows that I put in right here. I'll try and explain later why we do it this way. But for now, let me just give you the brief explanation that the UI will ask the business logic layer for some information. The business logic layer will ask the data access layer for some information. It'll get the information, and now the business logic layer might convert the information, do something with the information, and pass it back to the UI. So notice that I only have a line down doesn't mean that I cannot send data back up. I just don't have a reference. So that's the difference. So that's the architecture we're building right now. Let's just stop for now and say, now you guys know how we're setting up the different layers and how we make references to the layer. And now we can actually start making some code later on. See you next time.